The last goodnight. It was an ordinary Thursday night in June. The kind of night where nothing really happens. The sun had gone down. The streets were quiet. Porch lights flickered on in neat little rows. Inside one of those homes, a family was wrapping up their evening routine. Dinner dishes washed. Kids in pajamas. Everything calm. Everything normal. The father of that family was 39-year-old David Reynolds. If you asked anyone who knew him, they'd tell you the same thing. David was a good man. Not flashy, not mysterious, just solid. Dependable. The kind of person you could set your watch to. He worked a steady job at a local logistics company. He wasn't climbing the corporate ladder, but he didn't care. For David, life was about stability. His wife, Laura, and his 2 kids were his world. Neighbors often saw him outside mowing the lawn with his son tagging along, or carrying groceries with his daughter bouncing next to him. He showed up to every school play, every parent-teacher meeting, every soccer game, no matter how tired he was after work. People described him as almost predictable, the kind of guy who followed routines. Same breakfast every morning, same route to work, same bedtime rituals with his kids. And that predictability made him feel safe, made him feel reliable. But on June 14, 2018, that predictability would shatter in a way no one could have imagined. That evening, David seemed a little quieter than usual. Nothing dramatic, just distracted. At dinner, Laura noticed him pushing food around his plate. His eyes kind of glazed over. The kids were laughing, cracking jokes about school, and David smiled and played along, but it was like his mind was somewhere else. When Laura asked if everything was okay, David gave a small shrug and said, "Just a long day." She let it go. After dinner, David slipped right back into his normal routine. He helped the kids brush their teeth. He read them their favorite story, something he'd done so many times before that he could probably recite it from memory. Around 8:45 p.m., he tucked the blankets up to their chins, kissed each of them on the forehead, whispered "Goodnight," and closed their bedroom door. And that was the last time anyone ever saw him. The next morning, Laura woke up around 6:30. She rolled over and immediately noticed the empty space beside her in bed. First, she didn't think much of it. Maybe David had gotten up early to make coffee or catch up on work emails. But when she walked into the kitchen, the coffee pot was empty. No sign of him. She checked the living room. Nothing. She peeked into the kids' rooms. They were still asleep, safe and sound. But their father was nowhere to be found. That's when she noticed something strange. David's wallet was still sitting on the dresser. His phone was still plugged into the charger on the nightstand. His car was still in the driveway. Everything he would need to leave the house, money, phone, transportation, was untouched. Laura felt a chill crawl up her spine. She called his name through the house, searched every room, opened closets, checked the backyard. Nothing. It was like he had just vanished. By 9 a.m., panic had fully set in. Laura grabbed the phone and dialed 911. When officers arrived, they immediately started looking for signs of a break-in or struggle. They didn't find any. No broken locks, no forced entry, no overturned furniture. The house looked perfectly normal. But then they reached the back door. Laura swore she had locked it before going to bed, but police found it unlocked. That detail set off alarm bells. Did David unlock it himself and leave quietly? Or did someone else come into the house that night? Investigators canvassed the neighborhood. They asked neighbors if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. Not one person had. No strange cars. No suspicious figures. No sounds of an argument. Just silence. The official missing persons report went out within hours. Flyers with David's photo were plastered around town. His image spread across social media. Headlines read, "Father kisses kids goodnight, then vanishes without a trace." At first, the community believed this would be a quick case. Maybe he'd gotten lost, had some kind of accident, or stepped away for reasons no one understood yet. But as hours turned into days, and days turned into weeks, no trace of him appeared. The lack of evidence was chilling. He hadn't used his credit cards. He hadn't accessed his bank account. His phone records showed no activity after that night. For a man to vanish without money, a car, or even his cell phone, it didn't make sense. Meanwhile, Laura clung to hope. She kept telling the kids, "Daddy will be back soon," but even she struggled to believe it. Neighbors organized candlelight vigils. They stood outside the Reynolds home holding candles, whispering prayers into the night. The family's mailbox overflowed with letters from strangers offering support. But no answers came. The police worked every angle. They searched nearby woods. They checked surveillance cameras at local gas stations and stores. They interviewed coworkers, family, and friends. Every lead ended the same way, dead. And yet, the unlocked back door continued to gnaw at detectives. If David had simply walked out, where did he go? And why? If someone had forced him out, why was there no sign of a struggle? The Reynolds' two children, just 7 and 10 years old, kept asking when their father would be home. Laura told them the same thing every night. Soon, but in her heart, she wasn't so sure. As weeks passed, whispers began to circulate. Some people suggested maybe David had a secret life. Others thought he might have run away. Still others suspected something darker had happened inside that house. But none of those theories could be proven. What everyone did know was this. On the night of June 14th, David Reynolds tucked his children into bed, kissed them goodnight, and then disappeared into the dark. And as police dug deeper, they would discover small, unsettling details about David's final days. Details that only deepened the mystery of what really happened to him. The investigation deepens. When police first started digging into David Reynolds' disappearance, they assumed it would be straightforward. A man doesn't just vanish in the middle of the night without leaving some kind of trail. Maybe he'd gotten into an accident. Maybe he'd walked away for a few hours and something happened to him outside the house. Something. But as days went by, it became clear this case was anything but straightforward. Detectives interviewed everyone in David's circle. His wife, his family, his friends, his co-workers. They were all stunned. Nobody could think of a single reason why David would just get up and leave. At work, though, something interesting surfaced. One of David's colleagues said that in the weeks before he disappeared, he hadn't been himself. Normally, David was focused, methodical, but recently he'd been zoning out at his desk, staring off into space. Sometimes he'd step outside and take phone calls, long ones. He never explained who was calling. Detectives pulled his phone records. What they found didn't answer their questions, it only raised more. Over the course of a few weeks, David had received several late-night calls from an unregistered number. The calls were short, sometimes less than a minute, but they happened again and again. Whoever was on the other end wasn't a spam caller. This was someone who had direct access to David, and who David clearly felt compelled to answer. Police tried to trace the number. No luck. It was one of those untraceable prepaid lines. Meanwhile, investigators expanded their search radius. They combed through wooded areas near the Reynolds home. They brought in dogs. They even used thermal imaging equipment. Nothing. No clothing. No footprints. No signs of a struggle. And then, 2 weeks after David vanished, a neighbor came forward with a piece of footage. Their home security system, a doorbell camera, had captured something unusual on the night of June 14th. At 10:15 p.m., just over an hour after David tucked his kids into bed, the camera picked up a figure moving down the street. The footage was grainy, but the man's build and height were consistent with David's. He was walking quickly, shoulders hunched, heading toward the woods behind the neighborhood. Was this David, or was it someone else? Police couldn't say for sure, but if it was David, then he had left the house voluntarily. The question was why. Laura, his wife, was adamant. David would never abandon his family. She told detectives over and over again, he loved those kids. He would never just walk away. But if that was true, then what explained the strange phone calls? The distracted behavior at work? The unlocked back door? Weeks turned into months. The case grew colder. No new leads. No sightings. No activity on his bank accounts. No movement on his social media. It was like David Reynolds had been erased from the earth. that's when suspicion quietly began to shift. Some people in town started whispering about Laura. On the surface, she seemed devastated. She cried in interviews. She clung to her children. But investigators noticed small inconsistencies in her statements. For example, in her first interview, she said she was certain she locked the back door before going to bed. In a later one, she admitted she wasn't totally sure. Was this just the stress of trauma? Or was she changing her story? Detectives pressed her, but nothing ever stuck. She cooperated fully. She let them search the house top to bottom. She gave them her phone, her records, everything. They never found evidence linking her to David's disappearance. Still, doubts lingered. Detectives had gone over every detail of David's disappearance, and nothing made sense. A man doesn't just walk out of his house without his wallet, without his phone, without his car, and vanish into thin air. Yet that's exactly what it looked like. Then, 1 year later, something happened that breathed life back into the case. It was October of 2019. A group of hikers were moving through a wooded area about 20 miles from the Reynolds home. This wasn't a place people normally went. The trails were overgrown. The woods were thick. It was the kind of place you only found yourself if you knew exactly where you were going, or if you were hopelessly lost. As the hikers cut through a dense patch of undergrowth, one of them spotted something odd sticking out from beneath the leaves. First, they thought it was just a piece of trash, but when they pulled it out, they realized it was a jacket. Old, weathered, torn in places. Inside one of the pockets was a wallet. When they opened it, they froze. The ID inside read, David Reynolds. When police were called to the scene, they tested the items. The wallet, the jacket, they belonged to David. The fabric matched one of his jackets Laura immediately recognized. It was his. But here's where things got strange. That exact section of woods had already been searched. Not once, but several times by both police and volunteers in the weeks right after David vanished. And nothing had been found. So the question became, how did this jacket suddenly appear a year later? Was it possible searchers had simply missed it? Maybe the jacket had been covered by leaves and brush and only became visible months later. Or had someone intentionally planted it there, knowing it would eventually be discovered? The problem was, the jacket itself gave investigators no new answers. No bloodstains, no signs of a struggle, no DNA from anyone other than David. It was just there, a cruel, silent reminder that he was gone, and the discovery only raised more questions. If David had really walked into those woods the night he disappeared, why had no one found him? Why hadn't his body turned up? Why leave without his phone, wallet, or car, but somehow end up 20 miles away in a patch of forest? And if the jacket was planted, by who? And why? Was someone out there toying with investigators, dangling breadcrumbs to keep the case alive while hiding the truth? For Laura, the discovery was devastating. On one hand, it was confirmation that David had made it out of the house that night. On the other hand, it provided no closure, no explanation, no answers. Even worse, it reignited the hope in her children's hearts. They clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, their father was still alive. For Laura, who was slowly beginning to accept that David might never come home, it was like ripping open a wound that had never fully healed. Police doubled down on their efforts. They launched fresh searches in the woods. They re-interviewed witnesses. They went back through phone records. They even revisited the theory that David had been lured out of his house by someone, possibly the mysterious late-night caller. But once again, every lead fizzled out. No one new came forward. No new evidence was uncovered. The case drifted back into silence. In the end, all investigators were left with were fragments. A man who had seemed distracted in the weeks before he vanished. Several untraceable phone calls from a number that went nowhere. A grainy security video of a man, maybe David, walking toward the woods. And a jacket that turned up far too late in a place that had already been searched. To this day, nobody knows. All anyone has is the haunting final image. A father leaning over his children, tucking them into bed, whispering goodnight, closing the door, and then disappearing forever.